Well, hello there. Welcome back to A People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev. We're reading Chapter 18 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, broken up into roughly half-hour episodes. If we finish the chapter, we'll end there. We will not continue to the next chapter, so maybe a little short. I'm not sure how much longer we have in the chapter, so let's just go ahead and dig in, shall we? The anti-war movement, early in its growth, found a strange new constituency, priests and nuns of the Catholic Church. Some of them had been aroused by the civil rights movement, others by their experiences in Latin America, where they saw poverty and injustice under governments supported by the United States. In the fall of 1967, Father Philip Berrigan, a Josephite priest who was a veteran of World War II, joined by artists Tom Lewis and friends David Eberhard and James Mengel, went to the office of a draft board in Baltimore, Maryland, drenched the draft records with blood, and waited to be arrested. They were put on trial and sentenced to prison terms of 2 to 6 years. The following May, Philip Berrigan, out on bail in the Baltimore case, excuse me, how many of you just yawned because of that? Sorry about that. The following May, Philip Berrigan, out on bail in the Baltimore case, was joined in a second action by his brother Daniel, a Jesuit priest who had visited North Vietnam and seen the effects of U.S. bombing. They and 7 other people went into a draft board office in Catonsville, Maryland, removed records, and set them afire outside in the presence of reporters and onlookers. They were convicted and sentenced to prison and became famous as the Catonsville Nine. Dan Berrigan wrote a meditation at the time of the Catonsville incident. I don't know if it's Catonsville or Catonville. I'm pronouncing it how it seems like it should be pronounced. He wrote a meditation. Our apologies, good friends, for the fracture of good order, the burning of paper instead of children, the angering of the orderlies in the front parlor of the charnel house. We could not, so help us God, do otherwise. We say killing is disorder. Life and gentleness and community and unselfishness is the only order we recognize. For the sake of that order, we risk our liberty, our good name. The time is past when good men can remain silent, when obedience can segregate men from public risk, when the poor can die without defense. When his appeals had been exhausted and he was supposed to go to prison, Daniel Berrigan disappeared. While the FBI searched for him, he showed up at an Easter festival at Cornell University where he had been teaching, with dozens of FBI men looking for him in the crowd. He suddenly appeared on stage. Then the lights went out. He hid inside a giant figure of the bread and puppet theater which was on stage, was carried out to a truck, and escaped to a nearby farmhouse. Sounds like a movie. He stayed underground for 4 months, writing poems, issuing statements, giving secret interviews, appearing suddenly in a Philadelphia church to give a sermon, and then disappearing again, baffling the FBI until an informer's interception of a letter disclosed his whereabouts, and he was captured and imprisoned. The one woman among the Catonsville Nine, Mary Moylan, a former nun, also refused to surrender to the FBI. She was never found. Writing from underground, she reflected on her experience and how she came to it. We had all known we were going to jail, so we all had our toothbrushes. I was just exhausted. I took my little box of clothes and stuck it under the cot and climbed into bed. Now, all the women in the Baltimore County Jail were black. I think there was only one white. The women were waking me up and saying, "Aren't you going to cry?" I said, "What about?" They said, "You're in jail." And I said, "Yeah, I knew I'd be here." I was sleeping between two of these women, and every morning I'd wake up and they'd be leaning on their elbows watching me. They'd say, "You slept all night." And they couldn't believe it. They were good. We had good times. I suppose the political turning point in my life came when I was in Uganda. I was there when American planes were bombing the Congo, and we were very close to the Congo border. The planes came over and bombed 2 villages in Uganda. Where the hell did the American planes come in? Later I was in Dar es Salaam and Chun En Lai came to town. The American embassy sent out letters saying that no Americans were to be on the street because this was a dirty communist leader. But I decided this was a man who was making history and I wanted to see him. When I came home from Africa, I moved to Washington and had to deal with the scene there and the insanity and brutality of the cops and the type of life that was led by most of the citizens of that city, 70% black. And then Vietnam, and the napalm, and the defoliants, and the bombings. I got involved with the women's movement about a year ago. At the time of Catonsville, going to jail made sense to me, particularly because of the black scene, so many blacks forever filling the jails. I don't think it's a valid tactic anymore. I don't want to see people marching off to jail with smiles on their faces. I just don't want them going. The 70s are going to be very difficult, and I don't want to waste the sisters and brothers we have by marching them off to jail and having mystical experiences or whatever they're going to have. The effect of the war and of the bold action of some priests and nuns was to crack the traditional conservatism of the Catholic community. On Moratorium Day 1969, at the Newton College of the Sacred Heart near Boston, a sanctuary of bucolic quiet and political silence, the great front door of the college displayed a huge painted red fist. At Boston College, a Catholic institution, 6,000 people gathered that evening in the gymnasium to denounce war. Students were heavily involved in the early protests against the war. Students for a Democratic Society, which began at the University of Michigan and which issued the Port Huron Statement in 1962, a manifesto for participatory democracy, played an important part in organizing anti-war protest. A survey by the Urban Research Corporation for the first 6 months of 1969 only, and for only 232 of the nation's 2,000 institutions of higher education, showed that at least 215,000 students had participated in campus protests, that 3,652 had been arrested, that 956 had been suspended or expelled. Even in the high schools in the late 60s, there were 500 underground newspapers. At the Brown University commencement in 1969, 2/3 of the graduating class turned their backs when Henry Kissinger stood up to address them. The climax of protest came in the spring of 1970, when President Nixon ordered the invasion of Cambodia. At Kent State University in Ohio on May 4th, when students gathered to demonstrate against the war, National Guardsmen fired into the crowd. 4 students were killed. 1 was paralyzed for life. Students at 400 colleges and universities went on strike in protest. It was the first general student strike in the history of the United States. During that school year of 1969-1970, the FBI listed 1,785 student demonstrations, including the occupation of 313 buildings. The commencement day ceremonies after the Kent State killings were unlike any of the nation had ever seen. From Amherst, Massachusetts, came this newspaper report. The 100th commencement of the University of Massachusetts yesterday was a protest, a call for peace. A roll of the funeral drums set the beat for 2,600 young men and women marching in fear, in despair, and in frustration. Red fists of protest, white peace symbols, and blue doves were stenciled on black academic gowns, and nearly every other senior wore an armband representing a plea for peace. Student protests against the ROTC, Reserve Officers Training Program, resulted in the canceling of those programs in over 40 colleges and universities. In 1966, 191,749 college students enrolled in ROTC. In 1973, that number was 72,459. The ROTC was depended on to supply half the officers in Vietnam. In September 1973, for the 6th straight month, the ROTC could not fulfill its quota. One Army official said, "I just hope we don't get into another war, because if we do, I doubt we could fight it." The publicity given to the student protests created the impression that the opposition to the war came mostly from middle-class intellectuals. When some construction workers in New York attacked student demonstrators, the news was played up in the national media. However, a number of elections in American cities, including those where mostly blue-collar workers lived, showed that anti-war sentiment was strong in the working classes. For instance, in Dearborn, Michigan, an automobile manufacturing town, a poll as early as 1967 showed 41% of the population favored withdrawal from the Vietnam War. In 1970, in 2 counties in California, where petitioners placed the issue on the ballot, San Francisco County and Marin County, referenda asking withdrawal of the U.S. forces from Vietnam received a majority vote. In late 1970, when a Gallup poll presented the statement, "The United States should withdraw all troops from Vietnam by the end of next year," 65% of those questions said yes. In Madison, Wisconsin, in the spring of 1971, a resolution calling for an immediate withdrawal of U.S. forces from Southeast Asia won by 31,000 to 16,000 in 1968. Such a resolution had lost. That's just 3 years later. But the most surprising data were in a survey made by the University of Michigan. This showed that throughout the Vietnam War, Americans with only a grade school education were much stronger for withdrawal from the war than Americans with a college education. In June 1966, of people with a college education, 27% were for immediate withdrawal from Vietnam. Of people with only a grade school education, 41% were for immediate withdrawal. By September 1970, both groups were more anti-war. 47% of the college educated were for withdrawal, and 61% of the grade school graduates. There is more evidence of the same kind in an article in the American Sociological Review, June 1968. Richard F. Hamilton found in his survey of public opinion, preferences for tough policy alternatives are most frequent among the following groups: the highly educated, high status occupations, those with high incomes, younger persons, and those paying much attention to newspapers and magazines. And a political scientist, Harlan Hahn, doing a study of various city referenda on Vietnam, found support for withdrawal from Vietnam highest in groups of lower socioeconomical status. He also found that the regular polls, based on samplings, underestimated the opposition to the war among lower class people. All this was part of a general change in the entire population of the country. In August of 1965, 61% of the population thought the American involvement in Vietnam was not wrong. By May 1971, it was exactly reversed. 61% thought our involvement was wrong. Bruce Andrews, a Harvard student of public opinion, found that the people most opposed to the war were people over 50, blacks and women. He also noted that a study in the spring of 1964, when Vietnam was a minor issue in the newspapers, showed that 53% of college-educated people were willing to send troops to Vietnam, but only 33% of grade school-educated people were so willing. It seems that the media themselves, controlled by higher education, higher income people who were... It seems that the media, themselves controlled by higher education, higher income people who were more aggressive in foreign policy, tended to give the erroneous impression that working class people were super patriots for the war. Louis Lipsitz, in a mid-1968 survey of poor blacks and whites in the South, paraphrased an attitude he found typical. The only way to help the poor man is to get out of that war in Vietnam. These taxes, high taxes, it's going over yonder to kill people with, and I don't see no cause in it. The capacity for independent judgment among ordinary Americans is probably best shown by the swift development of anti-war feeling among American GIs, volunteers and draftees who came mostly from lower income groups. There had been earlier in American history instances of soldiers' disaffection from the war, isolated mutinies in the Revolutionary War, refusal of re-enlistment in the midst of hostilities in the Mexican War, desertion and conscientious objection in World War I and World War II. But Vietnam produced opposition by soldiers and veterans on a scale and with a fervor never seen before. It began with isolated protests. As early as June 1965, Richard Steinke, a West Point graduate in Vietnam, refused to board an aircraft taking him to a remote Vietnamese village. The Vietnamese War, he said, is not worth a single American life. Steinke was court-martialed and dismissed from the service. The following year, 3 Army privates, 1 black, 1 Puerto Rican, 1 Lithuanian Italian, all poor, refused to embark for Vietnam, denouncing the war as immoral, illegal, and unjust. They were court-martialed and imprisoned. In early 1967, Captain Howard Levy, an Army doctor at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, refused to teach Green Berets, a Special Forces elite in the military. He said they were murderers of women and children and killers of peasants. He was court-martialed on the grounds that he was trying to promote disaffection among enlisted men by his statements. The colonel who presided at the trial said, "The truth of the statements is not an issue in this case." Levy was convicted and sentenced to prison. The individual acts multiplied. A black private in Oakland refused to board a troop plane to Vietnam, although he faced 11 years at hard labor. A Navy nurse, Lieutenant Susan Schnall, was court-martialed for marching in a peace demonstration while in uniform and for dropping anti-war leaflets from a plane on Navy installations. In Norfolk, Virginia, a sailor refused to train fighter pilots because he said the war was immoral. An Army lieutenant was arrested in Washington, D.C. in early 1968 for picketing the White House with a sign that said 120,000 American casualties. Why? 2 black Marines, George Daniels and William Harvey, were given long prison sentences. Daniels 6 years, Harvey 10 years, both later reduced, for talking to other black Marines against the war. As the war went on, desertions from the armed forces mounted. Thousands went to Western Europe, France, Sweden, Holland. Most deserters, crossed into Canada. Some estimates were 50,000, others 100,000. Some stayed in the United States. A few openly defied the military authorities by taking sanctuary in churches, where, surrounded by anti-war friends and sympathizers, they waited for capture and court-martial. At Boston University, 1,000 students kept vigil for 5 days and nights in the chapel, supporting an 18-year-old deserter, Ray Kroll. Kroll's story was a common one. He had been inveigled into joining the army. He came from a poor family, was brought into court, charged with drunkenness, and given the choice of prison or enlistment. He enlisted, and then he began to think about the nature of the war. On a Sunday morning, federal agents showed up at the Boston University chapel, stomped their way through aisles clogged with students, smashed down doors, and took Kroll away. From the stockade, he wrote back to friends, "I ain't gonna kill. It's against my will." A friend he had made at the chapel brought him books, and he noted a saying he had found in one of them: "What we have done, we will not be lost to all eternity. Everything ripens at its time and becomes fruit at its hour." The GI anti-war movement became more organized. Near Fort Jackson, South Carolina, the first GI coffee house was set up, a place where soldiers could get coffee and donuts, find anti-war literature, and talk freely with others. It was called the UFO and lasted for several years before it was declared a public nuisance and closed by court action. But other GI coffee houses sprang up in half a dozen other places across the country. An anti-war bookstore was opened near Fort Devens, Massachusetts, and another one at the Newport, Rhode Island Naval Base. And let's close the episode there. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the reading. We did not cut Chapter 18 short, so tune in to the next episode and we'll probably finish Chapter 18. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and hit the notification bell because YouTube is known to unsubscribe people. Thank you for joining me. Hope you enjoyed the reading, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.